Hello, I'm Richard Nongard, and normally you'd be watching one of my educational videos, travel videos, cooking videos. I post a lot of really good recipes, but this video is unique. I think I've only done 2 other videos addressing religious subjects, but I just had to make this video. As the saying goes, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I got a call shortly after Hurricane Irene last week slammed into North Carolina as a Category 1 hurricane, and it then headed up the East Coast aiming straight for Washington and New York. This, of course, was only days after the top of the Washington Monument sustained a crack in a 5.8 earthquake, an unusual event in the East Coast, but not unprecedented. Well, after both of these events and shortly after Hurricane Katrina, I got basically the same call from a relative of mine. And that message was God's judgment. God is judging a nation that's turned its back on God and Israel, and that's why those things are happening. By the way, you're going to want to stay tuned for the end of this video. I have some charts and graphics you're going to love, so don't miss the surprise ending to all of this. Now, since this is a relative who's calling me, I don't want to stir the pot, stir the waves. Usually I keep my mouth shut, change the subject, and move on. But this time I decided to address it because I'm sick and tired of both bad theology and inaccurate information being the basis for people's religious beliefs. And I responded by saying that to believe such lunacy is the height of perverting the Christian doctrine, and it's factually incorrect. The response I got was a quote from Anne Graham, who said, "I would say for several years now that America has shaken their fist at God and said, God, we want you out of our schools, out of our government, out of our business, and we want you out of our marketplace." And the quote continues, that God, who's a gentleman, has quietly backed out of our national and political life, our public life, and has removed his hand of blessing and protection from us. And so the belief that these folks hold is that we have natural disasters that result in the death of people because of God's judgment and his hand being removed from our blessing and protection. My relative went on with a Bible verse to prove her point that the hurricane was in fact God's judgment on a nation that politically, she believes, doesn't support Israel any longer. By the way, that doesn't square with what we pay Israel. We pay them in economic support over $5 billion a year in direct assistance. Seems to me that's pretty supportive of Israel. But the Bible verse says, "I will bless those who bless you," referring to Israel, "and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you," referring to Israel. The theory here is, of course, that America is making political decisions that may not be in Israel's best interest. And so God, of course, is now cursing America. And that was followed by a few minutes of discussion about how Hillary Clinton is in the United Nations right now, turning her political support against Israel, and how this hurricane, Hurricane Irene specifically, was God's judgment for that. We know that because the hurricane was going up through North Carolina, on up through New Jersey, and eventually to New York. Seems like a lot of collateral damage to hit New York City, but that's, I suppose, a whole other issue. Now remember, at the time that I got this phone call, 6 people have died from Hurricane Irene. It had hit North Carolina, but had not yet hit New York City. I was able to gather some information on the internet about those deaths. Well, about 3 of those deaths. One man died of heart failure while preparing. Another man went out into the storm and crashed his car when it hydroplaned and he hit a tree. And one man was hurt by a falling limb. These are all deaths in North Carolina. Here's the theological question. If God wants to judge the USA for its sin with a hurricane, why the deaths of innocent people? People in North Carolina, rather than the people that these Christians are blaming for leading our country astray. Sounds to me like a couple of hardworking North Carolina family men and a college kid who thought he could drive in a hurricane were the ones God smited in this last hurricane. Is that really the belief that you hold? That God is mad at Hillary Clinton and so a college kid driving his car hits a tree? Well, the Bible tells us that in Revelation 20:11 that there will be a judgment day on a specific day, rather than randomly scattered judgment days occurring whenever we have intermittent bad weather here in the United States. In the recent tornadoes we had in Joplin, Missouri, ministries, and again I use the term loosely, claimed extra biblical revelation and knowledge of God's judgment. I found one website that was just fascinating. And here's what that website said. America has become the harlot of the world. And the writer says, I was watching a news video online showing the devastation in Joplin, Missouri from the tornadoes yesterday. Suddenly a wave of grief hit my spirit, and the Lord spoke to me and said, America hasn't seen anything yet. He then goes into a dire prophecy of America's judgment and how it doesn't know what it feels like to be under the mighty hand of God. But basically, paraphrasing here, don't worry, it will. And of course, well-known ministers claim that these events, Katrina, the tsunami, the Japanese earthquake, the Northeast earthquake, are all God's judgment.
It seems clear that the prophetic times I have been expecting for decades have finally arrived. And even worse, it appears that the judgment of America has begun.
After the Joplin tornadoes hit, this is just my perspective, I begin to share with my friends that I believe that Joplin was a sign that God's redemptive judgments are now beginning to be manifest concerning the issue of the shedding of innocent blood and abortion.
I don't want to get weird on this, so please take it for what it's worth. But it seems to me the Washington Monument is a symbol of America's power. It has been the symbol of our great nation. We look at that monument and we say, this is one nation under God. Now there's a crack in it. There's a crack in it and it's closed up. Is that a sign from the Lord?
Now I'm going to use basic college level logic here. Even if God were judging a nation with bad weather, why is he killing old black women from New Orleans rather than the infidels in Washington or the gays in San Francisco? Well, the answer is simple. None of those things have anything to do with God's judgment. And Hurricane Irene, Hurricane Katrina, a 5.8 earthquake that didn't kill anybody, the Joplin tornadoes are all not part of God's judgment. They're natural events that occur related to weather. If you believe that they're God's judgment, you're wrong. You're both a bad theologian and you're also one who doesn't come to conclusions based on fact, unless, of course, you think that God smites religious people because of the sins of other people. Here, let me explain that further by looking at some basic facts. If these natural disasters are God's judgment for political decisions or the immoral activities of others, one reason given for the earthquake in the Northeast was that New York recently allowed gay marriage to take place, then let's look at a couple of facts. Now what we're looking at this map here is the religious devotion or adherence to religion here in the United States. From this map we can clearly see the dark red areas, Texas, the Panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, the red areas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, the central states, the upper Midwest are among the most religious. We can also see that the least religious are Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington over here, the Pacific Northwest, as well as areas of the Northeast, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, over here on the East Coast, much less religious. And the next map is really pretty interesting. It actually shows us, you can see here, leading church bodies in the USA. What denominations are these religious folks? And this big giant red spot here are evangelicals and Baptists, Baptists being the largest evangelical denomination. And we can see this big red spot here is basically located in the South, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, the same areas where people tended to be the most devoutly religious. Now up here, this orangish color, yellow color is actually Lutherans, and over here the brown color is Mormons. The blue tends to be where we're either not religious or Catholic for the most part. Now Now let's look at a map that's really pretty interesting, and that map is where do people die from natural disasters. This is a map of the United States showing the density of deaths. It's essentially a death map of natural disasters. And one of the things that we can see here in our death map is that the red areas are the areas where people die most often. The pink areas is where they die less often of natural disasters. And the white area is kind of the middle of the road. And then the light blue and the dark blue is where you're least likely to die. Over here, by the way, incidentally, New York City, dark blue. Seattle, dark blue. Portland, dark blue. Many places in California on the left coast, dark blue. But over here, Utah, Arizona, Idaho, a lot of red spots there. Apparently God doesn't take too kindly to Mormons. Many red spots here in Texas. Arkansas, look at Arkansas, is almost a solid pink color. Lots of natural disasters here in the South, including Oklahoma, Missouri, etc. Now, this is really pretty interesting. Most of the natural disasters are concentrated in areas where religious people live, especially Baptists. So I suppose I ought to be careful, since I'm both a native Texan and one of my graduate school degrees was actually signed by Jerry Falwell. Look at the flat-out wrong idea that things are worse now than ever, and that this is because God's judgment, according to Anne Graham, is a result of God removing his hand of blessing and protection from us. The facts just don't square up with that belief that things are worse now than they were before. We now live in a 24-hour cable news cycle where all of the networks are scrounging for a breaking news story, and as a result, a hailstorm becomes a national emergency. And of course, politicians like Bloomberg have figured out that when they hype these things for political expediency, they can push them to the top of our consciousness. But this fact remains: if natural disasters are God's judgment, then he is judging us far less harshly today than in years gone by. Of the top 10 natural disasters in the U.S., only 3 of them have occurred in the last 90 years, which statistically, with a dramatically rising population, we have hundreds of millions of more people now, potential targets, than we did in the past. We should be exposing more people to the likelihood of natural disasters just because of statistics. But let's look at the distribution of disasters. Now, what I want to show you here are the 10 worst U.S. natural disasters. And number 1, of course, was the Galveston hurricane in September 8th of 1900. Texas is where Galveston is, the most religious state in the U.S. The number 2 most devastating natural disaster, the Dust Bowl throughout Oklahoma, another very religious state in the 1930s, I suppose smiting Pentecostals from Oral Roberts' home state. Number 3, the San Francisco earthquake of April 18th, 1906. And that killed several thousand people, many people homeless. But this was a half century before Haight-Ashbury, before Nancy Pelosi, and long before Harvey Milk. Number 4, the Okeechobee hurricane, September 16th of 1928, killed a lot of people in Florida, another conservative state. The heat wave of 1980 was the most prolonged natural disaster in our history, but occurred in the year that Ronald Reagan was elected. It primarily affected Baptist parts of Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, and other conservative religious states. The next worst natural disaster was the heat wave of 1988. That was, by the way, the year that George Bush was elected president, and our support to Israel continued. Then, of course, Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina, one of the worst natural disasters, certainly in the top 10, August 29th of 2005. It was widely reported by some of the more wacky TV preachers that this was attributed to homosexuality in California, which, of course, is really bad theology. To believe that God smites, because this is primarily who died, poor black Baptist women in southern states, because he's mad that Bob gave Jim a moment of sinful ecstasy in California. One of the other natural disasters, I think it's number 8 on our list, these aren't in order here on my slides, was the Jonestown flood of May 31st of 1889. Killed thousands of people in Pennsylvania, rural areas, people of devout faith. The Peshtigo Fire, one of our worst natural disasters, October 8th, 1871, was a forest fire, killing thousands of people in Wisconsin and Michigan. But this was in 1871, a period of time, I guess, that America was being judged for freeing the slaves. And then, of course, the tri-state tornado, our worst tornado in U.S. history, number 10 on our list, killed almost 1,000 people in 1925, primarily, again, in central states, religious states. And this, of course, was the year that Ben-Hur made its debut as an epic movie from Hollywood. Perhaps it was Hollywood's depiction of the nativity of Jesus Christ that really threw God into a tizzy this year. The point of all this is that it's the heart of religious narcissism, bad theology, and factual inaccuracy to attach every bad weather event in America to God's judgment. I probably didn't convince anyone whose pet beliefs were challenged with the facts, the logic, and the scripture, but I shared all of this with you because I cannot sit idly by while the gospel of Christ is distorted by any religious viewpoint, right or left, conservative or liberal. By the way, I also found this county by county map of obesity in America, those states and geographic locations with the greatest level of obesity. As you can see, it is in fact too many potluck suppers at the Baptist Church, because this is in fact the fattest part of America. Over here again, the religious West, and over here in the Southern Bible Belt. So perhaps all of this really is God's judgment, but the sin it turns out that God was most concerned about was actually gluttony. Hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation and it's helped you understand what the meaning of Job was all about. That something bigger is happening than you're going to understand, so stop trying to figure it out. Let me leave you with this verse from John 14:27, a verse reflecting the true nature of God. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Please don't listen to the fearmongers looking for a contribution based on your fear of God's judgment.